Okay, I guess we can start. We don't use the academic practice of waiting 10, 15 minutes as sometimes we do in continental Europe at least. But we start right on time. Well, first of all, I want to thank our distinguished guest here today. It's really an honor to have you here. It is, it has a flavor, a bit of a reunion, since we know each other, been working in a different project, and especially with UNIDROIT for a very long time. And I'm really glad to have you here because I learned a lot from each and every one of you. And here we are. So these, just few words. This is the first lecture of what we hope and plan to be a series of lecture that we are going to organize with the Asian Transnational Law Center at UNIDROIT. Basically, we are cementing the cooperation that already exists between HKU Faculty of Law and UNIDROIT, with actually a further cooperation agreement with our two centers, namely AIIFL and the Asian Transnational Law Center. So the idea behind this initiative, it's twofold. First, to showcase a bit what are the works of UNIDROIT, what are their implementation, what is the current issue, challenges, success, in order to understand exactly what UNIDROIT does and what is the effective impact in, let's say, worldwide, in many economies and jurisdictions worldwide. So we will organize these as a conversation and something that is a bit informal, in the sense that we have the privilege to have today the architects of UNIDROIT instruments. And so the real people that is supporting UNIDROIT in drafting the standard based on their practical experience, based on also on the different type of implementation. So to start off, I will see the time, I will pass the time to my good friend, William Brady Watson, who's the senior legal officer of UNIDROIT, and then he's the mastermind behind all this project. And so to start off, I'll pass the time to him, that will give us an overview, and then we will have a discussion and we will hear from our speakers, from our guests, different facets of the work of UNIDROIT. And then finally, from the AIIFL side, we will actually provide some comments or reflection, a point of criticalities, possible future collaboration. The idea is really to have a dialogue. We welcome questions from the audience. And then at the end of it, we will have a brief moment where we sign our enhanced cooperation agreement so that actually we cement this partnership. Without further ado, I pass the word to Will, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuliano, and good afternoon, everyone, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, those with us here in beautiful Hong Kong on a very nice day, and those online. It is a great pleasure to be here for our inaugural joint seminar with our friends at the Asian Institute of International Financial Law to discuss UNIDROIT's contributions in this area and to discuss a little bit about UNIDROIT's impact in Asia, strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully what we can do in the future to strengthen that impact. I have the easy job today. I'm going to speak a little bit about UNIDROIT just for 5 or 6 minutes to introduce the Institute for those of you who are unfamiliar. And then I will pass the floor to my learned colleagues who will take us through a whirlwind tour of 3 of our most important work areas. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, or UNIDROIT, is an independent intergovernmental organization that was established as part of the League of Nations in 1926. So we are separate from the United Nations. We have 65 member states from across the world. And we are primarily a legislative organization. That is our raison d'etre. That is why our member states paid their annual fees for us to create new international instruments in the field of international private law and international commercial law. So over our 99-year history, we have produced over 30 international instruments. And by that, I mean both hard law, treaties, conventions, protocols, as well as soft law, model laws, rules, principles, legal guides, guides to enactment. Traditionally, we worked primarily on hard law, as did most intergovernmental organizations. But in the last 30 years, we have joined the common move towards soft laws because of the very high rate of failures of hard laws. Over 70% of international commercial law treaties either don't enter into force or enter into force with such a low number of member states, contracting states, they aren't actually effective, which is one of the main reasons we moved to soft law. So we have, over our 99 years, we have a number of areas in which we work: international commercial contracts, access to credit, protection of the private aspects of cultural property, law and technology, private law and agricultural development. More recently, we've moved into sustainable development and also international, transnational civil procedure. So many different work areas. Our work agenda is set by our member states. Essentially, we work on 3-year work programs. Every 3 years, our member states come and say to us, here's the areas that we want privatisation. There is a selection process that goes through our governing council, and then us as a secretariat are told to bring together experts to actually develop those different instruments. Now, because we're primarily legislative and we're judged on the merits of the instruments we create, we have to partner with friends in relation to implementation. We don't have a separate budget or a large team for implementation. So we work very closely with different organizations around the world, both international and regional, that have a common interest in implementing our standards to try to improve, harmonize legal frameworks, and to ultimately improve economic development. So we work with the United Nations, and in particular, our friends at UNIDROIT, the United Nations Commission for International Trade Law, the Hague Conference on Private International Law, the European Union, the African Union, APEC. More recently, we've started some collaboration with ASEAN, but also a lot of the large international financial institutions that also work to facilitate trade and economic development around the World Bank Group, the Asian Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. These are all key partners for us who not only participate in the negotiation of our instruments, but more importantly, they work very hard to try to assist governments to implement these very technical standards to ensure they're actually useful at the end of the road. So that's UNIDROIT in a nutshell. One of the curious aspects of UNIDROIT is that we have a very strong academic element. And that's partially because when we were created in 1926, we were a part of the League of Nations. And our Secretary General Ignacio likes to say that we were almost like the world's first think tank in relation to private international law. We came up with concepts that were then adopted or negotiated by member states. And we've, throughout our 99 years, always based in Rome, Italy, we've retained this almost think tank-like nature in both our institution, because we have one of the largest and most important private international law libraries in the world, but also in the way that we undertake our work, which is reflected in our 3 experts today. Now, these 3 experts at the table are not only the top experts in their fields, but they've also represented their governments during negotiations. And this is the heart, at least I believe, of the success of UNIDROIT's model, is that our instruments at first are negotiated between the best experts from different countries and then later move to a governmental stage. So you start with trying to reach international best practice to the extent that's possible. You try to get the best instrument you can, negotiated by the best legal minds in the field, and then you move to the necessary political process. By starting with the law and then moving to politics, we often get better legal outcomes, whereas most organizations by their very nature, need to start with the politics and then move to the law. And maybe some of our experts can reflect on that today. A final part of our academic aspect is that because we have this academic nature of both our law library and of our participating experts, in 2021, UNIDROIT created what was called the UNIDROIT Academy. And the idea was to bring together all of our historic academic parts under one sort of one academy, essentially. So this covers our internship and research program that brings hundreds of people to Rome every year to study our instruments. It covers our law library. It covers different academic projects that we take in relation to our instruments, in particular the Cape Town Convention and the Cultural Property Convention. And it also covers these new centres we've created, including the UNIDROIT Asian Transnational Law Centre, or ATLC, that was created last year for the exact purpose of reaching out and improving our engagement with with Asia. We have 65 member states. Only 13 are in Asia. That's only 20% of our membership. Unfortunately, we are still a deeply Eurocentric organisation. And one of the ways that we're trying to improve on that is to partner with academic institutes, with law firms, with civil society across the Asian region through the ATLC. And that's the reason why we are here today, why we have undertaken this enhanced cooperation agreement with our friends at the Asian Institute of International Financial Law. And we hope that by opening this additional channel of dialogue with you in the room, with everyone we've got online, we can start to enhance the visibility of UNIDROIT's instruments, do some critical assessment of how they might assist countries in Asia in improving their legal frameworks, and how we might actually enhance cooperation together in the future to ensure that Asian and Pacific voices at UNIDROIT are clearly heard. I think that will do by way of introduction. We might now move to our three panelists. I'll introduce them individually. First, we have Professor Henry Gabriel, who's a wonderful friend of the Institute. He has worked on probably 10 instruments over his time with UNIDROIT, covering international commercial contracts, access to credit, agricultural law and development. He could speak on pretty much anything that we've done because he also sat on our governing council for 20 years on our top body that approves our instruments, sets our work program. He was voted in for 4 consecutive terms proposed by the United States of America. So we could talk about anything. I've had the pleasure of working with him for over 10 years on access to credit and as the chair of the Model Law and Factoring Working Group. But we've asked him to speak about international commercial contracts because it's probably the most famous of our instruments in the academic context and because it's been probably our most successful soft law instrument. Henry, the floor is yours.
And good afternoon. Will mentioned this move to soft law that we've seen in the last couple of decades. And I think it's important when we look at international commercial law treaties and conventions, there's been a lot of them, and it's probably been truly successful 3. The New York Convention on Arbitration, the CISG, and the Cape Town Convention. And the Cape Town Convention is one of our UNIDROIT's premier products. It's international secure transaction. But I suspect that if we looked at the 30-some instruments that we've done, the second most, or possibly the first most important instrument is the UNIDROIT Principles on International Commercial Contracts. And it is a soft law instrument. It is a model for people to use, for arbitration panels, for people to use as a template for international commercial contracts. And what I'd like to spend a couple of minutes explaining is why I think it has been very successful in the world of private international law, that the working methods of UNIDROIT and the fact that it's a soft law instrument leads it to be something quite successful. And I'd like to start with 2 points, and that is some of the successes of this instrument. It's a soft law instrument. It wasn't designed to be drafted to be enacted as legislation. Yet, It has been the basis of the Czech, Romanian, Slovak, Ukrainian, and Hungarian civil codes, and it inspired another half a dozen recent revisions of contract law. So it has been incredibly effective. It's setting the tone and the norms of contract law, both internationally and domestically. And it's now been the basis for a set of principles on reinsurance contracts. And I point that out because it's not only been very successful in modeling best practices of domestic law, but it's also being used to model best practices for very specialized international law. So it's been a very successful instrument. I think part of the success is that if we compare it to hard law conventions, we can see some of the difficulties we have with conventions that we don't have with something like the principles. And these differences create the type of instrument like the principles that tend to be much more successful than a lot of the conventions. If we look at why do we draft some model law or an international convention? And usually the drafters are being asked to do two things. They're being asked to harmonize the law, and they're being asked to upgrade the rules to reflect contemporary business practices. Now, one of the interesting things about that is that they're often contradictory. So what happens is the drafters are being asked to do something that you can't really do, or you can do, but you do it with great difficulty. And one of the beauties of the principles is, if I compare it with the CISG, because it's the easiest thing to compare it with, the CISG has been very successful. It's been ratified by 96 countries. It's one of the most successful international conventions out there. But what does it do? It actually does very little if you read it. What it does very successful. But the reason why it is so limited in its application was the felt need by the member states to harmonize laws that are not harmonious. So that if you ask people, well, can you harmonize contract law? And the answer is yes, as long as you stay within a given legal tradition. But if you do it across legal traditions, it becomes very difficult. And throw a little property law in there as well, because those of you that know a little comparative law know that comparing civil law property and common law property is like comparing apples and umbrellas. The fundamental concepts are different. So trying to harmonize is very difficult. And then what happens is people are sent to these negotiations, and what are they asked to do? They're asked to harmonize the law with their own law. It's a very political process. And the problem is that people have different laws, and that's a difficult thing to do. Now, how did we draft the principles? And the way we drafted the principles is first of all, it was drafted by a group of experts who were not representing their country. And that's very much an important part of the UNIDROIT process, is that people are there because they're experts and they're there in their individual capacity. So what happened when we drafted the principles? And what happened was we got to cherry pick. We got to pick the best of everything out there with no need to make any country happy, no need to keep the common law lawyers happy, no need to keep the civil law lawyers happy, no need to come up with these conflicting or vague rules. Just come up with the best that you can come up with. And another thing about a soft law instrument with principles is that any commercial code dealing with contracts or something like that it has to be a unified whole. It has to cover the whole area. But if you're given the opportunity to create it from new, you can do that. But if you're trying to pull a little bit from the Swiss Civil Code and pull a little bit from the English Sale of Goods Act and pull a little bit from the German BGB, it won't work. And the reason it won't work is because each of those laws are unified within themselves. So it's hard to pick and choose. You come up with a sort of a Frankenstein law, but with the principles, we didn't have to worry about that because we didn't have to satisfy anything. We could create, and I think we've been successful in creating a set of principles that are unified and connect themselves, so that if you read through the principles, they're very consistent from start to finish, from formation of contracts to the end of remedies and everything in between. But it is an internal consistency that was able to be created because it had no necessary requirement to meet anybody else's requirements, any domestic law. The late Alan Farnsworth, one of my teachers from I dare say 40, 50 years ago, was one of the drafters on the CISG, and he was also one of the drafters of the original version of the principles. And he pointed out, loved to point out, that the major difference between the two was the lack of politics in the UNIDROIT process. And Will alluded to that. And so I think it's a very important thing that if you start from the political and then have to work from the law to the law, that's a difficult thing. But if you start the other way around and say, let's get the law right, and then we'll worry about working out the politics later, it's much easier. There's another great advantage of soft law instruments. The CISG, and I use this as an example, will not be revised within our lifetime because it's practically impossible to take an embedded convention and say, let's revise it and then take it back out and sell it. It took, and people say it took 20 years to ratify the CISG. That's not actually correct. It took 60 years because the CISG was a revision of the UNIDROIT's International Sales Act. The CISG began in the 1920s, and it took 60 years to write that, and we're not going to revise it. The UNIDROIT principles are in their fourth iteration, and that and you can't do that with a convention. And why 4 iterations? To add on, to modify, and to correct. Because one of the problems with hard law instruments is they almost inevitably do not lead. And the reason they don't lead is because of the long process it takes to draft them. So what you're trying to do is catch up with the business practices ahead. What we were able to do with the UNIDROIT principles was get out ahead and say, what would be the best practices now and in the future? What can we come up with? And these instruments allow us to lead and say, this is where we think the law can go in the possibilities, as opposed to not being able to do that with a convention. And even once you draft these things, the nice thing about a soft law instrument like the principles, specifically the principles, is once they're done, you can use them. You don't have to wait 20, 30 years for a bunch of countries to ratify it. They're usable right now, and they're usable in any form that you wish. We like this, we don't like that. They're adaptable. You can't adapt a convention in the same way because it's sort of carved in stone. You know, you can say, well, we disclaimed this or that and the other, but a hard law instrument sets the tone for its use. Soft law instruments don't. They're templates. They're very usable. So it seems to me that the success of the principles are they were drafted with best practices in mind and able to achieve that goal by not having to make political compromises. They were drafted with the possibility of revision when it is necessary. And they were drafted with the idea that once they're completed, they're usable right at that time. And so it seems to me that those are the major points for why the principles have been so successful. And they have been successful. They're used in transactions hundreds, thousands of times, a week, because they're out there and they really smooth out commercial practice. Anyway, those were the points I wanted to make. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. That was wonderful. Please save your questions to the end. I'm sure you already have some. I think we'll go to all of our panelists and then we'll open up for an open discussion. Our next panelist is Professor Megumi Hara from Chuo University. We'll go to you next if that's okay. So Megumi has been involved with UNIDROIT work for over a decade, specifically in our areas of access to credit. She represented Japan in the negotiation of the Mining, Agriculture and Construction or MAC protocol to the Cape Town Convention. She's also been part of our expert working groups on the model law and factoring in this guide to enactment, verified carbon credits project, which is ongoing, and digital assets as well. Is that right? No, not digital assets. So today she's going to speak to us about our work in the area of access to credit, which is actually spans the most amount of instruments in any particular field. Megumi, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Will, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to focus more about digitalization and secure transactions. So I will be focusing not on the general work of UNIDROIT's secure transaction, which expands quite widely, but specifically on how digitalization and secure transaction intersect. So digitalization reshapes collaterals, right? So digitalization would produce new kinds of forms of value. So crypto assets, tokenized receivables, data assets. So these all become new types of collateral that we would have to deal with. But the credit markets continue to ask the same fundamental question. The question is, who has the right to prevail against others? So we really need to be able to answer that question when we are dealing with any case of secure transaction. So really need to have a clear cut content of the right, as well as how you can publicize this kind of rights. So in Japan, and I'm from Japan, so in countries like Japan, and I would assume in any other countries as well, or in many other countries, the response to these kind of questions start, at least in Japan, from regulatory rules. So response tends to come in having some kind of financial supervisions or market conduct rules or licensing. And we tend to start from there. And such rules are really very essential, as Professor Castellano would, of course, know very, very well. And it is really essential, but they do not provide the private law necessities. So we really need to know how third-party effectiveness, priorities, or any kind of other proprietary effects could entail from these kind of new values. So you need to really know the private law structures to have harmonized rules, just as Henry mentioned. So what kind of work has UNIDROIT done? So I think UNIDROIT's contribution, the biggest contribution, is to have a functional private law infrastructure to be able to harmonize and to promote the market, so promote the transactions. And what kind of instruments am I specifically talking about here? One major instrument I think Teresa will probably focus on is the digital asset principle. This has the most fundamental impact on digitalized economy. But there are other instruments as well, instruments that Henry took the lead, which is the factoring model law. Another instrument that is also related to digitalization and how new kinds of value will impact the market is the verified carbon credit that we are still working on. And another is electronic warehouse receipt. All of these can be a collateral. Well, a factoring model law, we are dealing with a receivable. So receivable can be a collateral, right? So all of these instruments are related to both digital asset and or digitalization and how it can affect secure transaction. One another important element that I should probably mention here that Henry and Will have most mentioned is the Cape Town Convention. So Cape Town Convention itself, does not necessarily promote digitalization, but is a premier secure transaction instrument of UNIDROIT. So I must mention this. It is one rare type of instrument, at least in recent years, because as Henry has said, the focus has more been on soft law instruments, but Cape Town Convention, as you can see, is a convention, so it's a hard law. But all of these instruments are there to promote harmonized secure transaction scheme. And how does UNIDROIT deal with that? I think there are three major characteristics to it. I'll just list three first and then explain a little bit in detail. So first, I think core characteristic that unify all of these work is it is approached in a functional way. So we call it the functional approach. Also derived from the functional approach is the technological neutrality. And that's the first pillar. The second pillar, I would say, that are the recent trend or recent unifying characteristic of UNIDROIT's instrument are probably that control is the legal proxy of possession. That's the second pillar, I would say. The third pillar, I would say, registry is the method for publicity. So transparency is done through registry. And this registry can be interoperable, which we are aiming for verified carbon credit, or it could be international, which is the premier and major importance for the Cape Town Convention, because it creates an international registry that can be registered globally, and you'll have a transparent priority rule throughout the world. That is very strong because usually you know that secure transaction law are domestic. So even if you have UCC type of registry, so Uniform Commercial Code type of registry, it only works in that specific jurisdiction. So if you can imagine movables that can move internationally. So Cape Town Convention targets expensive movable like aircraft, like rail, like space equipment, or MAC protocol, which is mining, agriculture, and construction equipment. You can imagine the high valueness of these equipments and that they could be transacted or they could actually move globally. So you cannot just have a clear domestic secure transaction rules to be able to create an efficient security interest over these equipments. So it is crucial, and the importance of Cape Town Convention is quite evident. So all of these three characteristics are, I think, the pillar of what UNIDROIT has been working on. So let me just briefly go into each of these elements. So first, I said functional approach. So UNIDROIT applies a method that is well established in private law, which is the functional approach. Functional approach regulates transaction by their economic function. So not by their legal forms, but by their economic function. I think this has two roots. One, I would say in European comparative law, the functional method has always been the basis for harmonization efforts. So they would do a comparative law analysis through functional approach, allowing states to keep their doctrinal identities while aligning the legal effects. That's the importance of functional approach, right? The second we can see under Uniform Commercial Code on secure transaction laws, which is that famously UCC adopted the functional definition of security interest. So it doesn't, regardless of legal forms like retention of title or pledge or any other type of mortgage or whatever you call it, doesn't matter what kind of legal form it takes. As long as something is so a proprietary right is created for the purpose of security, then you have created a security interest. That's the functional way of defining. So functional approach comes from different backgrounds, but it all leads to creating an international instrument that is clear on what kind of outcome you want. So that is the functional approach, and that's the approach that I think all UNIDROIT instruments have been keen on taking. Another is technological neutrality, which I think Teresa would probably mention as well. But digital asset, it could be anything, right? It could arise from it could be something like Bitcoins, or it could be something that arises from cloud. It could be in any kind of medium. So we don't want to have a medium-specific law that might be outdated in like 10 years, or maybe even shorter, like in 3 years. So we want to make a rule that is clear, that does not depend on certain technology. So in digital asset, the digital asset principle, digital asset is defined as electronic record that is subject to control. You don't see in this definition any type of medium or any kind of basis of what kind of technology it needs to be. So that's a very important point. Another point, control as a legal proxy for possession. Digital asset principle define control as legally recognized capacity to use, transfer, and exclude others. So that kind of notion of control is very important, and it determines the perfection and priority rules. So registry as publicity. So especially for secure transaction, registry is the gold standard rule to create third-party effectiveness and to create priority. First to register is the one who gets priority, right? So this is clear in Cape Town Convention, and it is also clear in factoring. But registry is also important in creating an asset, especially for voluntary carbon credit. So for verified carbon credit, it's important that it's a registered asset. So registry comes in creation as well as as well as third-party effectiveness rules. So they come in both ways. So I think those three criteria kind of summarize how the law functions. Well, the UNIDROIT wishes to function. And it shows how UNIDROIT tries to adopt this new environment to law. So how law can adopt to this new environment is important. So we have classic definition of like possession, delivery, documentary title, or physical certificate. They are all adapted into the digitalization, into like notions of control, ledger entry, registry, token, or accounts. So UNIDROIT's function has been to try to adopt these adopt law to the new environment that we are facing. I was going to talk about Japan, but I think my time is up. Okay, yes. Thank you. Sorry, I should have summarized better, but yes, I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Megumi, for that excellent tour de force of some of the core aspects that cross more than one of our instruments and across a broad range of our access to credit instruments. Perhaps we can talk about all three of your experiences representing the United States, Spain, and Japan during the Q&A period. We'll now move on to our third speaker, Professor Teresa de las Heras Rodriguez Balel, who's been a wonderful friend of UNIDROIT, indeed for about the same time, slightly longer than I've been with the Institute. She is a professor of commercial law at Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. She recently began her term as the president of the European Law Institute. And like our other two speakers, she is qualified to speak across a vast range of UNIDROIT's instruments, having worked on international commercial contracts, on access to credit, in particular, the MAC and rail protocols to the Cape Town Convention, on our instruments in the field of transnational civil procedure and enforcement, as well as digital assets. But in compliance with our theme today, we've asked her to focus specifically on digital assets and cross-border enforcement. Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Will, for the introduction. So kindly thank you, Professor Castellano, dear Giuliano, for inviting us and hosting us at the university. And thank you for being here, all of you participants in this webinar. This seminar. I have to say that working with UNIDROIT is probably one of the most intellectually stimulating experience. You realize that you are doing a work that has a social impact, And you are doing that with surrounded by other experts and great people. We have been together indeed in expert groups as an expert, drafting committees. We have been together in intergovernmental expert committees that is close to this final stage that a particular convention is going to take. And even we have been so lucky so as to be part of a diplomatic conference. Something that is, as you can imagine, very unique and very exciting because you are negotiating and adopting a convention, a treaty, and a treaty as successful as the Cape Town Convention. Henry has already explained how successful the CIG is, and the Cape Town is very, very close in terms of the ratification map and the impact that is having around the world. So just to share with you this stimulating and really fascinating experience that means to work for the international lawmaking through the UNIDROIT instrument. UNIDROIT this year, next year indeed, is going to celebrate the centenary, 100 years of work contributing to the unification of privately in the world. 100 years means that, as you can imagine, that the trade has profoundly transformed and has evolved significantly, taking into account the technology progress. So what UNIDROIT has done for digital economy, for the digital trade in this period of 100 years. So what I would like to do is to identify in this contribution of UNIDROIT to digital trade, to identify 3 different phases, 3 different stages. In the first stage, UNIDROIT was reactive. I'm going to explain why I use this term, reactiveness. In the second stage, UNIDROIT has been permeable, receptive. And in the third stage, UNIDROIT has been proactive, has been really shaping digital trade law. Let me explain one by one. Reactive. The very, very first stage of UNIDROIT work on digital trade law has been when UNIDROIT principle that Henry has already explained had to be adapted to electronic commerce. That was the very beginning of the digital trade. At that particular time, UNCITRAL, United Nations Commission of International Trade Law, was or had been already adopted, was working or has been already adopted, the model law on electronic commerce. So, were the UNIDROIT principle properly adapted to the use of electronic technologies at that time? What kind of changes and adaptation were necessary to guarantee, to ensure that UNIDROIT principles were working properly and effectively at the very beginning of the digital economy? Some changes, very, very minor, really minimal changes, were made in the UNIDROIT principle. And these UNIDROIT principles are still today working very effectively for the digital trade. What happened afterwards? During probably 20 years since then, we have seen how UNIDROIT has been working on a variety of instruments, all of them absolutely suited to the digital trade, but without any specific rules for technology. And this is very important. That means that for 20 years, technology was considered something given. Technology was there. So technology was, in a way, a reality that was naturally embedded into the instrument. How that was working on the basis of 2 fundamental principles that Megumi has already mentioned: functional equivalence and technology neutrality. So what was the idea? Even if technology was not particularly referred to by any provision, however, we can naturally apply the same rule to the functionally equivalent. So anything that we could do with the same economic function using any kind of technology at any time. That was probably the first decade of the current century, the 21st century. But what happened today, and this is fascinating, we are entering into a third phase in the digital economy. Functional equivalence and technology neutrality, probably they are not sufficient today. And why is that? Because the challenges posed by technology today, they are too big, they are really disruptive. And that is not enough to base our regulation of the digital economy on the functional equivalence principle or the technology neutrality principle anymore. And that is the reason why I see how UNIDROIT is proactively regulating the digital economy. So it's decided to identify this is a challenge that required harmonized or uniform rule. I am going to be the organization leading this particular harmonization. I have 3 examples to illustrate this proactiveness of UNIDROIT. The first example is the very famous Cape Town Convention system. The Cape Town Convention, as Megumi mentioned before, is based on specific equipment, secure transaction in specific equipment, and the effectiveness against third party is based on registry. This registry is an electronic registry. So UNIDROIT has positioned itself in favor of one particular technology-specific model. The registry has to be electronic in order to perform the allocated function. In this case, technology is decisive, has to be electronic to work as it is working or expected to work. The second example that I have for you is one of the projects I am also working on, is the ongoing project on best practices on enforcement. In this case, best practices on enforcement, we also see how technology is a best practice. It's not an equivalent practice, it's a best practice. So you are more effective in enforcing if you are using technology. So again, UNIDROIT is proactive. And the third example that is definitely, in my opinion, the most ambitious and the more clearly pioneering in the area is, as Megumi mentioned before, digital asset and private law principle. Why? Because in this case, UNIDROIT has decided to provide a solution in an area where the diversity of possession and the lack of a common understanding of what digital assets are or could be were making very difficult to find harmonized solution at another level. So UNIDROIT has decided to use a soft law instrument, certainly, it's not a convention, too much at the moment, guiding principle in private law and digital asset. What means private law and digital asset? That, as my dear friend Giuliano main field is regulatory, financial regulation, is not about financial regulation. It's indeed about private law and very particularly about proprietary right, the property status of digital asset. To which extent digital asset can be or not the object of proprietary rights. Can I be the owner of the digital asset? Can I create a security interest in a digital asset? Can I use digital asset as collateral in secure transaction? This is the main question that UNIDROIT has solved, has answered very effectively. Their principle, because as I mentioned before, is clearly touching probably one of the most, one of the areas where the sensitiveness of the different jurisdiction is more intense, property law. Property law is these areas where it's really difficult to harmonize. And that is why UNCITRAL, with the model law on secure transaction, has managed to create a common landscape, and how Cape Town Convention has managed to do that with an extremely wise success factor, is equipment specific. And that is why it's so successful, has identified problems related to sectors that are very strategic. And they are related to mobile equipment, as Megumi mentioned before. Okay, so let me, if I may, in a couple of minutes or three, I would like to give you two main ideas about this DAPL, digital asset and private law principle of UNIDROIT. There are three ideas I would like to discuss with you. The first one is definition. What is a digital asset? So we are assuming that digital asset is a comprehensive notion that represents a variety of assets, a new class of varied or various assets indeed. So how to define that? UNIDROIT has decided to define digital asset based on two conceptual components. They are electronic record, a notion that we are very familiar with in international transnational law, the one that we can find in UNCITRAL text, for instance. But an electronic record is not enough. It's not enough to talk about property, right? Why not? Because if we talk about possession, if we talk about transfer, if we talk about holding, if we talk about value, we need to reproduce in relation to that electronic record possession. And as Megumi mentioned before, is the idea of having an electronic record. This electronic record represents something, value, Bitcoin, represent an interest in a particular asset, for example, warehouse receipt, or we are talking about NFT, non-fungible token, that is representing IP right in relation to a particular original work. In all cases, we have an electronic record representing value of any kind or interest or right, and then we have control. This is the second component. To the extent that I can control this electronic record, we can apply and we can simulate the notion of transfer of asset, security interest in asset, as we can do with the tangible or intangible one that we know so well. Okay, so the definition is extremely wise, is very open, but manage the idea that regardless of the type of interest and right we have, we are covering this new notion of digital asset as a new class of asset. Okay, there are other definitions. You can find similar definition in the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 12, with this idea of controllable electronic record. You can find a similar definition in the Model Law on Electronic Transferable Record, Electronic Transferable Record, or you can find a longer definition in the European Law Institute Principle and Model Rules on Digital Asset as well. So in all of them, you see that there is this seed of control and electronic record as well. Okay, so this is the first, in my opinion, excellent finding and contribution of the DAPL of UNIDROIT. The second is the complex and challenging question of legal characterization. So what is a digital asset? Is something totally new that we don't know? This is, in my opinion, I'm not being very precise here, but it's more or less the approach that United Kingdom has adopted when decided to create a third root for asset. So creating a new category is very much about the idea of not recognizing digital asset as existing or fitting into existing models, okay? The other possibility is, okay, let's try to find what are the most similar equivalent in the existing norms as digital asset. So digital asset could be a title of credit. Digital asset could be a check. Digital asset could be securities. Digital asset could be money, Bitcoin, for certain countries, not all of them. Or digital asset could be something that is indeed totally new. For example, if we have tokens representing immovable property, so we tokenize a piece of land, that token is representing certain interest or right in the immovable property. I agree that this is completely true, but what is that? Is a immovable property per se? Probably not. Is this a tangible movable asset, intangible movable asset? It is a certificate of the ownership. It is a title, transferable document that can be transferred and therefore transferring as well your interest in the movable property. So it's new. Do we need to accept that this is new? Okay, so the second approach is the legal taxonomy or the legal characterization of these particular tokens or digital assets. Very smartly, UNIDROIT DAPL are not prejudging the legal characterization. It's providing an excellent neutral legal framework within you can play with the different component, notion, and legal rules that you have. The third and the last point I would like to talk about in relation to the DAPLs is enforcement. Enforcement. Why? Because if we talk about digital asset as asset, if we think about digital asset as collateral, at the very end, this collateral have a purpose. They are, in a way, reinforcing the position of the creditor. And the creditor has expectation about what happened in case of default or what happened in case of insolvency, right? So my expectation as a creditor is that, if necessary, I can enforce. So I can repossess or I can liquidate or realize the value of that collateral. We know how to do that when the collateral is an equipment, when the collateral is an asset that we already know. But can we really do that when the collateral is a digital asset? And how? And why this how is so important? Because there are many practical problems and challenges that we have when we want to enforce against digital asset. For instance, as you know very well, if I am the holder of a digital asset, I am the debtor. I am holding the digital asset because I have control by use of my private key. This private key could be held in my personal wallet. Okay, so for the purpose of enforcement, the creditor, extrajudicially or by way of authority, want me to transfer the control in that particular digital asset to the enforcement agent, to the court, or to the creditor. Do you agree? In order to do that, I need to voluntarily or enforced by a judicial order, I need to use my private key for that purpose or make that private key available. Good? What happens if I don't want to? If I don't want to, the traditional measures that we have in procedural law are not successful. They are quite ineffective. Okay? So we need to ensure that our procedural law is working as well in the environment of digital asset. Otherwise, all the system, no matter whether we conceptually say digital asset are asset, second, digital asset can be collateral, yes, but what happened in the market? In the market, unless creditors believe and rely on the expectation of enforcing against digital asset, the system is not going to work. And that is the reason, let me conclude, why, even if in the DAPL you only have a very short principle on enforcement, at the same time, in parallel, UNIDROIT is going to finalize a guide called Best Practices on Effective Enforcement that is including a section explicitly devoted to enforcement against digital asset. So UNIDROIT is deciding to complement the entire legal framework for digital asset, not only on the conceptual side, not only access to credit, but also on enforcement. And I am working on this project as well, chairing this group that is drafting and producing the best practice on enforcement against digital asset. Very happy to discuss further any point that you consider of your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panel for their tour de force. I hope this has given you a little idea of the work being undertaken at UNIDROIT. We'll pass across now to our friends at AIIFL for their comment. But I'd just like to remind both everyone in the room and everyone online that once we've had our comment, we will open the floor for Q&A. So for those online, if you want to start typing your questions into the box, we can start preparing those questions. Thank you very much, please. Well, I'm very happy to introduce Professor James Zheng, who is a professor at the University of Hong Kong. He's got a distinguished background in both the theoretical aspects of law, but more importantly, in this context, on normative evaluation of laws, which is essential for UNIDROIT because for us, it's very hard for us to sometimes assess the impact of what we think is a good model, but often it's hard to assess as to whether it's living up to its aspirations. So, Jim, we're very, very honoured and pleased to have you to be providing the critical comment on these presentations. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. So as a member of the faculty, I would like to extend my warmest welcome to all the guest speakers. And as a colleague of Professor Castellano, I want to thank him for giving me this opportunity to join this very interesting and thought-provoking seminar. So let me begin by saying that I have a lot of respect for what UNIDROIT did and have been doing because of two major reasons. First of all, I really like private law, and UNIDROIT is doing private law. So the reason I like private law is because over the years of my research and teaching, sometimes I do public law, sometimes I do private law. I got a feeling that when I talk about public law or regulations, oftentimes I have to engage with a lot of economists, like financial regulation, like they will set the standard, capital adequacy ratio. What is the appropriate ratio? Like the economists have the most say. But when it comes to private law, usually it's the lawyer who has the most influential impact because, well, when we talk to the economists, they don't even figure out what is the difference between contract and property. They don't have these concepts in mind. So I like to be the person who's doing the most important work. So that's why I like private law. And second, the reason that I respect what UNIDROIT do is because it develops this best practice for different countries. And that's something I always like to do. I'm probably the only person on this panel today who's from a developing country, China, of course. So as someone from developing countries, I always have this quest for the best practice, learn from developed states and see how they do things, and can we copy that? Can we promote economic development? That's the goal or the mission of legal scholars from a state like a developing country. So the idea of the ability to find out the best practice and then promulgate it and let more countries to learn and develop their legal system is something that I do find interesting. So that's why I really enjoy today's seminar, and I have a lot of respect for UNIDROIT. So I want to talk a little bit about potential projects that I think that you might be interested in, most of them based on my projects. So I've been doing corporate law mostly, and empirical legal studies, law and finance so far. So in listening to some of the talks today, I keep having this question in my mind, can we do something like a project on corporate law, a best practice about corporate law or creditor protection in corporate law and shareholder protection in corporate law. So the immediate thing that comes to my mind was a paper that was written in about 2000 which is called The End of History of Corporate Law, which basically said that there is a best practice for corporate law that all countries should just follow. There's a model. So Professor Henry Hansman and Rainer Quackman developed the idea. But then that paper was subject to a lot of criticisms over time. They say that, well, there are also differences across countries. You can't just let a country pick some of the good rules from another and then develop it, which is exactly what Professor Henry Gabriel mentioned in his talk. But I think that's a little bit an overstatement. That there's a lot of area in corporate law which are close to private law, somehow similar to private law. And over time, we do see some convergence between different countries. And that's exactly the area that I think there's a lot of potential for finding out what is the best practice and how different countries can learn from each other and develop this system. So let me just give some example. One example is the doctrine of veil piercing, which I've been interested in the past. So China actually just amended its corporate law to develop this idea, and they introduced a new doctrine called horizontal piercing. In the past, it's most like vertical piercing. Right now, they have horizontal piercing. So vertical piercing means that the shareholder will be liable for the debts of the company, whereas horizontal is more like two sibling companies are liable for each other's debt. And China is also thinking about amending its bankruptcy law, which introduces for the first time the idea of substantive consolidation. Also means that when we have a corporate group, there's a creditor who's want to sue one of the companies. And then if that company cannot fully pay off the debts, the other members of the corporate group would also be liable. I think that's also related to international trade because, well, in the past, you might think that most of the companies that engage in international transactions may be large companies that are never bankrupt. But in recent years, I think an increasing number of companies that are so big, like also has failed. Like I'm mainly thinking about the China's economy, which is not doing very well. So there might be situations where bankruptcy may kick in and there are issues about how to deal with the debts of these companies. And then naturally the problem of piercing of the corporate veil and substantive consolidation would arise. So there are certain principles we have to discuss which relate to the substantive consolidation and veil piercing. For example, different jurisdictions have developed some case law about the factors that the court should consider, including fraud, commingling of assets, where the company keeps books and accounting, and whether the shareholders or other companies exercise undue control. So those principles, like over time, can be developed, and more cases and illustration can be developed into a principle or something like that. That's the first thing that I come to my mind. So to some extent, you can say that's maybe related to politics, but I don't think politics play a very large role in this determination. It's mostly like private disputes between companies, and all companies, like in different jurisdictions, may have these shareholders who exercise undue control and sibling companies in which they have a lot of transactions, but the debt is not quite clear. So I think that's an area where we see a lot of convergence over the year. We see mainland China moving towards more doctrines that are quite prevalent in other jurisdictions already. So I think there's room for some kind of a best practice in those areas. It seems that time flies. So I'll just skip the other doctrines that I have in mind. We can talk more about it. Another issue that I want to mention is in response to Megumi and Teresa about digital assets. So I've been also doing something in this area, which is called stable coins. So in the past few years, we do see some development in different jurisdictions like United States, Hong Kong, and EU. They all have this new law about stable coins. So in the future, we are likely to see more of these cross-border transactions using the stable coins as a intermediate tool or instruments for transactions. I wonder whether there's any need or demand for a more unified transaction like structure or the organization of the issuers. So like, what are the rights of the stablecoin holders? And what are the obligations of the stablecoin issuers? And how do we deal with their property, especially with regard to the reserve of the assets used to back those stablecoins in the case that the stablecoin issuer become bankrupt? I think those are the pressing issues we face these days as we move towards the digital economy area, like we all face. I'd also have some comments on empirical law and finance, but I think I've used up my time, so I'll hand over, and later we can talk more about it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, well, where to start? Let's start by saying that I am the guy that generally is kind of a black sheep in the group, precisely because I'm doing regulation and financial regulation. I know. No, but actually, it's a running joke that we have. So, but this is the point, right? Let me start for what has been said at the very beginning, right? Introduced by Ari. So at the very beginning, we do have this idea that we focus on the legal rule. And we focus on the legal rule with the idea to actually to isolate what is the best standard, and this best standard in order to actually to even more distill it and isolate it from politics, let's say. So, and that's absolutely crucial to have a certain type of legal standards that look at how rule works effectively and how they are effectively implemented. But this also creates a problem in recent years, and especially when you look at the implementation of this rule. I'm particularly involved in the implementation of several international standards, pretty much been working in more than 20 jurisdictions, where actually the request that you have from the jurisdiction is not generally, oh, can you please give me model X or model Y, UNIDROIT principle or this other thing. But, and, you know, we wouldn't expect that because actually they might need to be educated and then actually explain that there are these best practice out there. But what they generally ask is, I do want to, let's say, broaden access to credit. I do want to implement a new rule that allow payments through stable coins, or I do want to create a trading facility that allow my company to essentially trade receivables on electronic form. So that's the type of question that generally jurisdictions, policymakers ask to most likely development organizations such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and then the multilateral system. And they ask for technical assistance. Little they know that then at some point they send one of us. So, and in particular, when there is a very specific rule that needs to be implemented, we have to, first of all, explain that there are international standards, and that's fundamental because if you don't have international standard, everyone will come up with their own great decision, which might not be that great and might not be ultimately harmonized. So the risk is that you do have what we call sometimes the rogue expert. So the expert that says, I solve the issue of the word, and then, you know, this is how it should work, and then it departs completely from what are all the other international standards. So international standards are useful, and then as was explained before, they also allow for some adaptation, the functional approach, the technological neutrality, the fact that sometimes we are based more and more on soft law principle allows precisely on the implementation stage people like us that actually to adapt by keeping the doctrines, as Megumi was saying, intact, or at least in a large part, but then trying to achieve some functional equivalent approach. Now, this coding, this adaptation is somehow physiological in a sense that actually, you know, the law, the private law, any law is not just something that you can plug and play somewhere. The success of UNIDROIT instruments also, and this was actually mentioned pretty much by everybody, but is also the fact that is going towards soft law instruments which are quite specific to needs or product, like the factoring model law for receivable finance. You do have a compact system that is essentially telling how to enable this type of product and promote access to credit, and then development and growth, as we said. Digital asset principle, how to deal with digital assets, enforcement, and so on and so forth. So this is another evolution, right? You know, that you can only obtain with soft law instruments that have a certain level of adaptation. But then here comes the other issue. When you are implementing those standards and when you are, or better, not when you are implementing those standards, but when you're answering the jurisdiction question, how do I facilitate access to credit and therefore economic growth through intangible assets as collateral? whether receivable, intellectual property, digital assets, and so on and so forth. Well, there you need to dig into the regulatory system for one simple reason. Since the global financial crisis, and I don't want to digress too much, but the regulatory perimeter has been expanded massively. There are rules that are very detailed, but also based on general agreement at the G20, G7 level. Like, we don't want our bank to be, let's say, to be rescued with taxpayers' money, and therefore we do have to have a special resolution regime. And then before that, we do need to have a specific level of capital requirements. To give you a sense, the way, and that this is something that I'm often mentioning in class here, so forgive me for those of you that attended and hearing repeating this again, but the Basel Capital Accords, which are the rules that effectively establish at international level the level of capital requirements that every banking institution should hold, used to be in the 1974 when the first had been adopted, 34 pages, something like that. The latest iteration of the Basel Accord, the Basel III, which has been engineered after the global financial crisis and will be fully implemented in 2028, is 1,900 pages. Okay, so now not every jurisdiction implements all these parts. There are also principles there. There are also more detail. What's the problem then? Well, the problem is that what we in private law define as a credit that has been secured under the Basel principle, the Basel Capital Accord, is treated as unsecured. So that means that all the effort that's been done to say, hey, here you have a sophisticated, functional, effective private law system to lend against all the type of collateral that small and medium enterprises have, receivables or intellectual property, non-real estate, essentially. Well, is going to clash with the fact that the regulators will tell you the bank will treat it as if was without collateral. So we have to, and here I take your hook, we have to bring this discussion into the legal debate, because we as lawyers, we see the conflict between that. We see the problem, and we see also the problem that we cannot go against one or another international standard, but we have to find a way for them to coexist. Even more if we talk about technology. If we talk about technology, digital assets, the regulatory system has been establishing also a technological neutral approach that is based on the idea, same activity, same risk, same rule. But the approach that has been adopted is more granular, and the distinction between different digital assets has been made. So we do have mentioned stable coins, for instance. Well, stable coins are, in the eye of the regulator of the Financial Stability Board, treated as bank money. Now, the question is, should private law do the same thing? Should also private law treat this type of digital assets, stable coin, as bank money? There is a lots of discussion in that, and there are people that disagree. And then there is the, no, it's more similar to a document of title or a negotiable instrument or so on and so forth, because there is a reserve attached. But these are the type of question that actually, when you are in a jurisdiction, try to fix or improve or help to improve a specific area to the benefit of the people of that jurisdiction, you need to face. So coordination is needed, and here I conclude. We do have good example of coordination. UNIDROIT, for instance, although is the institute focalized on private law, as the name suggests, does have knowledge, that has capacity to draft the private law rules, such as the factoring, the model law on factoring, in consideration of how they are going to be used and the fact that these are going to be considered as regulated activities. And then so I guess if we look at the future, I guess that's even if UNIDROIT and other sister organizations stay on the private law because that's their mandate, we should actually have a much more open debate, and considering that ultimately, if we're talking about economic substance, we do need to understand what happens in the economy, and we do need possibly also to educate the economic area of the law that actually affect our instruments, because otherwise we do have different standards that do not communicate to one another, and then they struggle to deliver effective benefit. And that's pretty much also the theme of the conference of tomorrow and the day after, on coordination, like how to coordinate this type of rule. I think I leave it here.
Thank you very much, James and Giuliano, for those wonderful comments. I think this panel could probably spend another hour and a half discussing the issues that have arisen.
Thank you very much. Let me, join me to thank our guest again. And then, as you can see, it's a vibrant discussion. There is lots of aspects that needs to be explored further. And I really hope this is going to give us a good start for our seminar series, where actually we can dig deeper in all these aspects. So join me to thank our speakers.